Hello and welcome again to What If Natives Won, a video blog and channel about alternate history and American Indians, Native Americans, indigenous peoples. My name is Carroll. I'm Associate Professor of History at Northern Virginia Community College. I've written mostly about wars, veterans, human rights, and genocide. I'm also, together with Rob Schmidt of Bluecorn Comics, editing and putting out a short story collection, What If Natives Won. This is what this video blog and channel are about. There's a huge lack of alternate history written about American Indians, indigenous people. Many people don't like to think about genocides in America. They likely were never taught about them. Many don't want to be reminded, want to believe these genocides never happened or it was an accident. I've had great success using alternate history to teach my students, show them that absolutely nothing in history was inevitable. It never had to be. The worst of human history is always a conscious choice. How things turn out is based on how evil the evil choose to be, and how well and how strong good people choose to stand up to them or stop them. The way things turn out in history took a very specific set of circumstances. Sometimes history can turn on very small things. Change even one, and you have an entirely different history, different present, different society. It may be hard to hear this now, but we live in a dystopian world, one of the worst of all possible outcomes for anyone who is not white. America is today 98% non-native. At least 75 million to 112 million natives were killed by not one genocide, but a series of them. There were many genocides, the last of them ending only in the year 2000, in America, Brazil, Canada, Guatemala, Argentina, and Mexico. On top of that is massive genocide denial. This is not taught in almost all American schools. There are racist images everywhere that are often not admitted to be racist. Much of this could change if Americans had to deal with native voters, native congressmen, and at least one mostly native state from the very beginning. Today we'll look at the proposed state intended to be a refuge for natives early on. During the War for Independence, the Delaware Nation, under Chief White Eyes, signed the Treaty of Fort Pitt. The Delaware traditional name for themselves is Lenni Lenape, originally living in what is today New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, and of course Delaware. But by this time they had been mostly driven out west into Ohio River country. After this treaty, they sent a proposal to the Continental Congress by mail, asking for what the Treaty of Fort Pitt already proposed and guaranteed: make us the 14th state. Have a state intended for natives, with voting rights and members in the new U.S. Congress. The argument was the U.S. wouldn't have to worry about Indian wars as a new nation. The mailed proposal sat unread, never looked at by Congress. What if the proposal came in person, with Delaware leaders and American treaty signers there to argue for it? Imagine the proposal coming as the war is at its worst for colonists, during the famous winter at Valley Forge. This may convince Congress. The area proposed as a state for natives is today Ohio. As you can see, Ohio country is not exactly like Ohio today, but it is pretty close. Congress accepts it. The Delaware Nation offers refuge for the many facing land loss in the eastern U.S. Some, like the Iroquois, are unlikely to accept refuge and struggle to hold on to their homelands. Others, like the Pequot, Narragansett, and other New England and Mid-Atlantic tribes are, for they have already lost so much land and people and are small and very vulnerable. Those tribes in Ohio already, the Shawnee, Wyandot, Potawatomi, Erie, Mingo, and Miami, certainly benefit from their homelands declared off-limits to colonists, but have to accept other tribes will take refuge too. No doubt some colonists still try to invade, but they will be facing native lawmen, native militias, native judges, courts, jails, and legal punishments. The new native state of Ohio will have 2 senators and at least 1 congressman. America as a new nation will deal with natives as voters and elected officials from the very start. It is not guaranteed. The biggest danger is that colonists invading will outnumber the dozen or so tribes. But America had other states as refuges for groups before. Maryland was intended to be a refuge for Catholics, Pennsylvania for Quakers. Both of these groups were later outnumbered by others, but Utah became a successful Mormon refuge. As you can see on the map, it is still today over 80% Mormon, with a culture very different from its neighbors, especially Nevada next door. Could this set a precedent? Would there be other native states as refuges? The most likely ones would be the 5 civilized tribes farther south. the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Muskogee, and Seminole. If Jackson or anyone else insist on the Trail of Tears or anything like it, they in turn insist on a state of their own. Keep in mind the Trail of Tears only passed in Congress by 2 votes. The Delaware state's votes in Congress are enough to block it. Looking at the map, one sees the areas likely to be 2 new states. One of them, the northern half of Mississippi and a bit of Alabama, and the second, North Georgia, Northeast Alabama, and the western tip of the Carolinas. This would more likely be before Alabama and Mississippi become states in 1818 and 1819. What about further west? As we can see from a map of native reservations today, the territories most likely to become states would be northern Arizona for the Navajo, Hopi, and Apache, and part of the Dakotas for Dakota, Lakota, Nakota people, and other Plains tribes. Creating these states cancels many of the so-called Indian Wars, with colonial invaders having no legal recourse because they'd face native judges and judgments. Many of the best-known battles don't happen. No Little Bighorn, no battles with Geronimo. Many of the worst massacres and forced removals may be prevented, like Wounded Knee and the Long March for Navajos. Could California Indian genocide be stopped? Perhaps in the new state of Pico. Perhaps also because congressmen from native states like Ohio demand it be stopped. What about for other ethnic groups? The first ones I suggest are likely would be for Mexicans after the war with Mexico. As you can see on the map, New Mexico might be intended as a refuge for both Mexicans and the Pueblo city-states. Southern California had a high Mexican population back then as well, and there was a failed proposal for it to be its own state in our own history. The proposed state would have been called Pico, named after California leader André Pico. The proposal was everything south of the 36th parallel would be Pico, a border slightly north of Bakersfield and San Luis Obispo. South Texas from San Antonio to the border, both then and today, is 90% Mexican. Some might object that Texas would not agree to this, but Texas already lost over half of its falsely claimed areas to New Mexico. Both that and the South, the Rio Grande Valley, Texas never had any actual control over during its supposed independence. That would mean 3 more states as refuges, 2 for Mexicans and 1 for Mexicans and natives. The other very obvious needed states would be for former slaves after the Civil War. Mississippi and South Carolina had the highest black populations at the time, before many blacks went to the Northeast or West Coast. South Carolina also began the Civil War. It would be a nice irony to declare it a refuge for the people it harmed the most, slaves. Both states already had over 50% blacks. Those proportions go up, while those in other southern states drop. The loss of black labor in those other states might mean better wages or bargaining power for them once the populist movement starts. One objection I sometimes hear is this is segregation. That misunderstands what segregation actually is. Understand, no one is losing rights. Look at the definition here under apartheid. To be segregation, a group has to lose power and be kept second class or worse. In none of these states would whites actually be kept out or discriminated against. Just as in Utah, no one ever stood at the state line and asked if you were Mormon before you enter. But bigoted non-Mormons had to deal with a system set up by Mormons, and Mormons were protected from violent campaigns they faced before. Another comparison is women's public bathrooms. Are women losing any power or threatened by their own restrooms? No, they are kept separate because some males have not yet learned to not abuse females or respect privacy. This is not segregation, but separation for protection and respecting boundaries. That is what these refuge states would do, the same as Utah did for Mormons. In fact, these refugee states would be most like Canada's territory of Nunavut, mostly Inuit people today. Giving them a separate unit of government gives them a greater voice and autonomy. Nunavut is a success story in some ways, with high economic growth. Having these refuge states would bring the U.S. closer to an anti-racist, equal society far sooner and more completely. Segregation is not only likely to end sooner in America, its harshest forms may never start. Laws like Jim Crow, black codes, the foreign miners tax, Chinese exclusion acts, and one racist immigration law after another will face opposition from congressmen from these refuge states. It's even possible women vote sooner. Most abolitionists were also feminist, and Native societies had women voters and leaders from the start. This is the end of the 13th video. I look forward to your comments and questions and will answer them as often as I can. Racism, genocide denial, childish behavior, personal attacks get deleted. But I do recognize some questions will be asked in ignorance because much of the facts I point to are new to most people. They were never taught about this. They've been raised in denial. They've been raised in denial since denying indigenous genocides is taught in almost all public schools. Next time we will discuss, what if the British set up a native nation in Florida and Alabama? Please repost freely, subscribe, like, share, and comment. I will post again in about a week. This has been What If Natives Won video blog and channel.